So thank you everybody for joining our first afternoon session of the second day Agile UX Virtual Summit. Of course, we're here with Indy Young, and she's author of multiple books on UX, and she's also was one of the co-founders of a very well-known agency, Adapt Path. And today we're basically going to be looking at how can we make empathy a more actionable tactic within the overall product development process, and especially within the Agile process, since it's so popular. And so if you have any of or any questions, you can just go ahead and drop them in the Q&A box. Otherwise, Indy, feel free to introduce yourself, and then we can just get right into it.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everybody. I know there's some people out there who I already know. So hi to you guys. And to everybody who hasn't run across me yet, you're going to absolutely love the kind of stuff that I talk about, because it, like Jerry said, is really actionable. It's very practical. It's all based on, 2-3 decades of experience actually trying to face the same sorts of things that you guys are facing. So this is a set of tools for really helping people reduce risk, helping people convince people above them that they're making the wrong decision, helping people innovate, helping people come together as a team, and also have a roadmap and going forward and a much better strategy. So this is a little bit more from a business side of things. The kind of stuff that I do actually, the stuff that I help people do has nothing to do with design. It has to do with giving you a solid foundation so that your design makes a lot more sense. So practical empathy, I think I want to start off by saying that the idea of empathy is multifaceted. In psychology literature, there's at least 8 different definitions. There's 2 definitions that I use. I want to get into those. Those 2 definitions are the ones that we can use in our work. And there's also 2 sides to empathy. Whenever you say, oh, hey, I want to have empathy with users, or it makes sense to do more empathy with users, but, how do you do it? It kind of comes down to like, oh, I walk in their shoes a little bit. So I put on their costume and I pretend I'm them. And that's true, but that's the application of empathy. And what's missing is the development of empathy. And what I want to do is call your attention to this idea that if you are trying to empathize, if you're trying to walk in someone's shoes without having first developed empathy with them, then really you're just walking in your own shoes. You know nothing about their shoes, or at least you don't know enough depth about their shoes to really do it. Okay, so I think that's a super important thing. If you're just joining now, ask me to repeat that, because that's the key to all of this. So let me jump into the 2 different definitions of empathy that I use. One of them is called emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is being able to recognize an emotion that someone is going through and help them through that emotion. Help them achieve what they want to achieve because of that emotion or despite that emotion. But it's recognizing all of that. It's taking their side. And I've got a great example, actually. Last weekend, there's a foot race around my town. It actually runs from a certain town all the way up over this big mountain, Mount Tamalpais, down to the beach at Stinson Beach. And then you run into the water to finish. And it's been running, I think they've been doing it for 105 years now. So I am a volunteer coordinator for a certain part of this section. And we have, the race course. You guys have all been to a race before. I'm assuming you've seen one, at least. There's the course, there's the spectators, and there's like a little, row of flags in between to keep the spectators from tripping up the runners. And there was a local neighbor who wanted to drive out of her driveway up the race course with all the runners to go to an event. And she was really upset. She knew the race was coming. and yet she did this. So I run up to her and I'm like, stop your car. I don't want you to run over anybody. And she's really angry. Really angry. I'm not going to run anybody over. I'm going to go here and I'm going to go there. And I don't like the way that you yelled at me. And I hate you. And I hate this race. And I hate you, person. Yeah. Okay. So you get the idea. I can understand what her emotion is. So if you were going to empathize with her, you would say, oh, totally, right? You sort of get on board. It's like, yeah, this race every year, right in your front yard. She's like, yeah, damn it, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, she said, oh, I got home last night from work at 2 a.m. and I just totally forgot that it was happening this morning. So now we've gone a little step into it. She's willing to tell me that. And I'm like, oh my God, totally forgotten it. I can understand this 2 a.m. getting home at 2 a.m. Because if you'd remembered, you could have parked your car outside the race course. And she's like, yeah, that's what I do every year. And I'm like, oh, totally. So now we're having a conversation. She's coming down off of her anger. I managed to get her turned around so that she's going with the runners and can go out a little exit that we have built for the cars. But we couldn't do that until she got over her emotion, right? That is a little example of emotional empathy. If anybody has watched that Pixar film that's called Inside Out, that's also a great example. There's a couple of scenes in there where Sadness, the character Sadness, does some empathizing and turns things around. So that's emotional empathy. Now, as you can tell, you're not necessarily going to be in an angry situation with your client all the time unless you are in customer service or you're an IT desk or something like that. But it still helps to understand as people are interacting with you, as teammates are interacting with you, as bosses and subordinates are interacting with you, to really recognize what that emotion is and be able to take that emotion and not just fight it, but work with it. So that's emotional empathy. I don't use it as much in the work I do as I use cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is the second kind of empathy. It is consciously building an understanding of what is going through somebody's mind and what is going through their heart. How are they making their decisions? What kind of guiding principles are those decisions based on? What kind of life experiences have they had? What kind of emotion is making them act a certain way? Collect all of this for a certain scope. I'm making parentheses here. And within that scope, you want to look at a whole bunch of different kinds of people and see if you can find patterns. When you find patterns, you can build that up into a structure I call a mental model diagram, which then you use to look for opportunities. You look for gap analysis. You look for different ways to support people differently because they have different philosophies. So cognitive empathy is what I use to create something called a mental model diagram, as well as something called thinking styles or behavioral audience segments. These are pretty much the same thing as personas, only they don't have the bad rap that personas have, because personas have been misused or actually made up, shall we say, without any research. And you just can't make this stuff up. You really can't. So that's the definition of what empathy is. And what I want to talk about now is applying it versus developing it. Okay, so what I see a lot in my clients is that they want to use empathy, but they're trying to apply it and it has different definitions for different people. And it just feels too slippery. It's unusable, mostly because they're trying to use emotional empathy as their definition. If you use your definition of cognitive empathy, now we've got a starting point for what we can do. If we have patterns that we've developed from a bunch of different people, then we can start to see, oh, look, there's a certain thinking style this way that's different than the thinking style this way. I did a project once that looked at how certain software engineers solve bugs. So we had a certain way that we were recruiting within a certain scope, but I went and talked to them. I'm like, okay, last couple of bugs you had to solve. Talk me through it. How'd you do it? What'd you think? And it turned out that there were a couple of different thinking styles. One was the person who's like, immediately I kind of reach out to my network because someone somewhere has a thread that I can pull and it eventually gets to the answer. There's another thinking style where it was, I'm just going to dig into the code and I'm digging deeper and I'm doing more research and I'm all kind of insular and I'm going to solve it by myself. So it's very different thinking styles, and people fell into those different thinking styles. That meant that that company that I was doing that work for could actually try to support those people differently. So I think they were doing some sort of a developer network to have two different kinds of developer networks. I mean, clearly the developer network for the people who reach out to the net, right, to pull that thread. But let's focus on that kind of thinking for that sort of thing. But for the person who just does the research, let's think of some other solution for him so that they can find that information more readily, or they can have a repository of stuff they've already looked at, or better tracking or something. So that is the difference between, so what I want to do is get back to the difference between applying and developing empathy. So you can't apply empathy unless you've developed it. If you try to apply empathy without spending time developing it first, you are making it up. Either that or you're making an application or a design for yourself, which is fine. I mean, a lot of the apps out there are for the people who've designed them. But of course they get blindsided and they get very boxed into their own way of thinking. And the market that's just like them and matches their thinking style is a lot smaller than what they originally thought. So it's really a good idea to understand the broader market and what those broader patterns are. If you guys are in front of a computer, which I'm assuming you are, flip over to a browser and open up indieyoung.com. On indieyoung.com, there is a blue or a turquoise diagram that I want to walk you through, because this has to do with Agile. I always get the question, it's like, okay, so how do I fit empathy into the Agile development cycle? And my answer is, well, you don't fit developing empathy into that cycle. You can only fit applying empathy into that cycle. And I need to be super clear about that. So if you have gotten to that website, there is a double cycle listed there. The cycle on the left, and I don't care which side it's on, we could do top bottom. Some people are like, you should switch the cycles. And I'm like, whatever. What I'm trying to do is talk about, hey, we've got our Agile cycle, we've got our lean development, we're coming up with ideas, we're prototyping those ideas. Maybe we're testing those ideas first, we're evaluating whether they work. Maybe we're evaluating our designs. Maybe we're evaluating how we're doing the delivery of it as we're delivering. Right? And then we're cycling back into ideas. This is the typical cycle. You guys should be familiar with this, right? This thing spins really fast. This is the thing that is measured, and your bonuses get, based on this, or maybe not bonuses, but your yearly reviews or whatever are based on how fast you can go through this thing. So what I'm saying is you can't slow it down. And I'm not asking you to slow it down. I'm asking you to consider a separate cycle for developing empathy. You don't have to do the separate cycle unless you need it. Okay, this is super important. If you're developing something for your own way of thinking, then great, you don't have to do that cycle at all. But if you're developing something for alternate ways of thinking about something, it really behooves your organization to get some data. And this data, develop this understanding of the inner thinking, the cognitive empathy of a series of people, and then develop those patterns and understand what those patterns are. That's something that you can do separately. It has nothing to do with the Agile cycle. You can't fit it in there. Don't even try. It is something that you do when you have some sort of a break. It is something that maybe a separate team does that interacts with you sometimes, or it's something that you do once every year or once every 2 years. Okay, do you understand that that is something separate? And the reason I'm separating it out is because of this idea of the word user. Okay, everybody uses the word user, and in fact, Jerry used the word user when describing or titling this Q&A session. And a user is someone who has a relationship to your organization. When you're developing empathy with people, I don't want to develop empathy with people who have a relationship to my organization, because that puts them in a box. I want to develop empathy with people. Okay? People. A person who has a purpose. Someone who's got an intent, trying to get something done. Understand that. And then apply it to your development cycle. Okay, so in this little diagram, I've got this idea of a M and an A. Those are the two things I was talking about, the behavioral audience segments, or the thinking styles, and the mental model diagram. These are the artifacts that are the patterns. They hold all those patterns from all of the listening sessions that you've done. And those are the things that you use then to influence how you innovate, or influence how you do gap analysis, or influence which path you take for the next quarter or the next year in terms of what you're doing. Is how you prioritize. It's how you understand people. Okay? You can use these things in ideation. So you'll see the M and the A over in ideation. You'll be referencing them quite a bit. You might also use the behavioral audience segments in design, because you might be designing for one style of thinking versus another style of thinking. Okay? So this is the difference between the solution space and the problem space. There are plenty of things like jobs to be done that talk about problem space, design thinking, they talk about empathy, but they all still try to put it inside the same cycle. I don't think it fits inside the same cycle. The only place it fits is when you're using that data that you have developed elsewhere. Okay, applying versus developing. So let's talk about developing real quick. Developing empathy has to do with listening. You cannot develop empathy without listening, because we don't have telepathy servers yet. And so you have to talk to people and then try to dig into their answers. Get past that bubble that they've built around them. It's the bubble of all of their preferences, and the bubble of their opinions, and the bubble of how they do things. And get down into what actually went through their mind as, say, they were trying to solve the last couple of bugs that they were doing. Find out why they did that and where that came from. Maybe there's a guiding principle underneath that. Maybe there's some sort of an experience that they had that didn't work very well, and they never want to do that again. So there's a little bit of a fear reaction, like, oh God, that could happen again, let's not do that. So I think that separating them out, knowing that you can run this developing empathy cycle once a year, once every 2 years, once every 5 years, whenever you need. I actually worked with one client, one only, who did 8 studies in the course of 14 months. Usually my clients do 1 study every year. Okay, it's not much. All right, let's talk super quick about, I'm going to touch on the questions, but I also want to touch on how to do it. So if you're going to do this once a year, there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a super shortcutty way where you won't have those patterns around, and you collect about 30% of what you would collect if you did it the non-shortcutty way. But it's still good enough for certain cases. You won't have any of that data lying around that you can reference again later. It sort of evaporates. Whereas if you do it the long cut way, right, the formal way, you'll have this data laying around that you can add to over time. The interesting thing about developing empathy with people is that we're not talking about them using a tool. We're talking about what's going through their head as they try to solve a problem, right? It doesn't have anything to do with how they're using a tool, and therefore if the tool changes, you'd have to throw that data out, but their thinking's not going to change. People's approach to things changes very slowly. And so you can keep adding to this data. And in fact, I love talking about this. There have been several studies that I've done where I could have gotten in a time machine and gone back a couple generations and talked to my great-grandmother or great-grandfather and used their data. It was perfectly valid data that I could then resolve and develop something in the solution space to support. And using that word support, I also want to mention that a lot of the time people will think of empathy as a way to manipulate people. And yes, people who are intent on manipulating people do need to understand people at a deep level and develop empathy with them. I actually try to veer away from any sort of manipulation. My intent is to support people. I want to support someone's purpose, help them get that thing done that they wanted. So here's a super quick example. There's a level of like a task, which might be, oh, I want to book a flight, right? There's the level of a goal, which might be, I want to go see the Grand Canyon. But then there's the level of a purpose, which is, I'm going to take my mother to go see the Grand Canyon while we still can, because she's 77, she's never been, and really wants to see it. But the last time she flew was a really anxiety-inducing experience. So I'm not sure that a flight is the right approach, or maybe a flight that's super simple, and how could I deal with that? Plus, I'm coming from a different city. So how do I meet up with her? Where do I meet up with her? What makes the most sense so that I give her an experience? Maybe I should fly to her city first and go with her. You know, all of this stuff sort of goes through your mind. And it doesn't just say, it doesn't stop with like, I want to go see the Grand Canyon. There's a lot more to it. And it's this lot more to it that so far we haven't been supporting. There are no tools out there that do that sort of thing, and yet it can be supported. There's a lot of opportunity out there that we are leaving on the table because we're not understanding that purpose. We're stopping with the goal. Okay, so I think tools like Jobs to be Done and design thinking, they aim at the purpose, but the vocabulary that they teach it with doesn't, I think, help the teams who are using it get past that goal stage. I think that's their intent. I think the teams that use it don't get past the goal stage. So they're just like helping someone go vacation at the Grand Canyon. So great, here's a hotel and a car. Okay. Right, that doesn't help me and my mom. Anyway, okay, so let's start going through some of the questions. One of the first questions was, what are some techniques that you use to tie building empathy into the actionable items? I think that the diagram, this turquoise diagram, kind of answers that, and I'd like to hear if there's a follow-up question to that. But I use mental model diagrams, which is like a city skyline, to align what we're doing and how we're supporting people, and zero in. Most of the time people are zeroed in on one little tiny part of that mental model diagram for a quarter or for 4 quarters or 5 quarters. They're zeroed in on that, and they're going, okay, we're messing with the approach here. We're gonna maybe split it into 2 paths so that, you know, the kind of people who reach out to get answers are supported in a different way than the kind of person who researches and keeps things internal, okay? So that's how we are trying to tie it in. Next question is, and I did answer the first part of it, but how do you understand empathy when the users for the application you're building are not reachable or not co-located? So there's that word users. I want to take that word users out of there, and I want to say people. Okay, so what are the people trying to do? What is their purpose? Not their goal, but their purpose, a bigger purpose. Try to understand that. If they're not reachable, if they're not co-located, that's fine. I do all of my research by telephone, all of it. Okay, so it's really hard to find people who are not reachable by telephone. There are humans who are not reachable by telephone, in which case you know, go out with the anthropologist into the jungle or whatever, right? But I'm going to say they're reachable. If they're not co-located, they're still reachable by telephone. The non-reachable part that I've run into is people who are very busy. People whose jobs, like a data storage expert, there's only one of you for like this entire thing. You're always busy. You don't have time to do a listening session with some researcher out there, right? So that's when you start doing incentives, or you maybe try doing it at a conference that person has attended. Also executives, they don't care about incentives. You can't pay them anything that would make them want to spend an hour with you, but you might be able to offer them some data back again that they could use. So that's how I reach people who are unreachable. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, and Indy, let me see here. I was going through some of the questions as well, and I was thinking actually that so this question I think is actually really relevant, and most people can probably can probably relate to this, which is in your experience, working with all the different clients, what have you found to be useful for having product managers, product owners better empathize with, let's say, like with the potential customers? Is there a particular process or set of tactics that you've seen kind of helps to, help them shift their mindset?
Yeah, okay, so working with product managers, I think a lot of product managers really get this, and then there's another set who are just so nose to the grindstone that this doesn't seem to fly with them. I haven't been able to convince them. For those that see the value really is, again, I'm trying to get people to understand the two sides of it, okay? User, sure. Person, different. The two sides of it, yes, applying your empathy versus developing your empathy with a person. And when you see the value, sometimes I have to demonstrate the value by showing them some of the other information that I've done for other clients. Most of it's proprietary, but let's take, for example, an airline project that I did where the airline pretty much just exposes its system in the reservations. And here you are, here's a system you can pick from all of these airplanes that we have flying between different airports. Go for it. And yet there's this idea that everyone we spoke to talked about, which is try to figure out what it takes to get there. What it takes to get there. So for me and my mom, it's like, how am I going to figure out an experience for her that's calm and not anxiety inducing? For another person, it might be, I've only got N budget and I've got 3 kids to take with me on vacation. For another person, it might be something along the lines of, how do I do it so that I can visit my brother here and still go to my meeting over there? There's all these different things that can be supported with a tool, and that tool just literally doesn't exist right now. There is no tool that helps you sort of consolidate this, and yet we've got all this data, say about bad weather at airports during certain seasons, so you may not want to connect at those airports. We've got all this data about how you've chosen your flights in the past. Maybe you never choose a very early morning flight. Well, there must be a reason for that. Let's understand it, and let's customize our data, or customize the experience for that person based on that data, based on what we understand their thinking style is. Okay, so for those that have their nose to the grindstone, they're pretty much ignoring anything that doesn't have to do with the plates they already have spinning. And to say, hey, look, there's another plate I want you to spin, doesn't work. That's also why I say this is not a part of the Agile process. Developing empathy is not a part of the Agile process. Applying it is. Okay, does that answer that?
Yeah, and that's actually a really good segue into the next question here, from somebody who I think this is a very real challenge right now. This person is actually hosting a 30-minute sort of lunch and learn for their team on how to apply empathy to the Agile process very soon, and she's wondering, are there any ideas you might have for just a quick, easy activity that would help to get developers, at least get them introduced into this mindset?
Oh, sure. Developers actually, for my understanding of a lot of the thinking styles that the developers I know have, they love this stuff. It's helping make decisions more clear. It's helping make the path forward more clear. So with Lunch and Learn, what I would do, I don't know, there's a lot of stuff that you have to know, which is what I started this with. Basically, it is the difference between a user and a person, the difference between solution and problem space, the difference between applying empathy and developing empathy first. And so I think that you could start with that because that would help define it. If you wanted to do a little project, that can't possibly be done in a lunch and learn. You could definitely go through projects that have already been created, though. On my website, I have a little fun one. I went and spoke with a bunch of canines, channeling through their owners what went through their mind during the past day. So we had a really vague kind of a scope. We just wanted to understand. But I've got a dog mental model out there. It's called Eat, Smell, Pray. It's on my resources page under the newsletters. I believe it should be there. And if not, you can, oh, you know what? It's probably on the research and examples page. Anyway, Eat, Smell, Pray is all about, as you can tell from the name, kind of the way a dog thinks. The article goes through all the steps that I used, from the speaking with the dogs, channeled through their owners, through, so that's just the listening sessions, right? Trying to understand what is important to them and what they want to bring up. There's also then going through the transcripts of that and trying to pull out the information, so sort of normalize that information and then look for affinities across different dogs. Once you get those affinities, you can start building it up into a mental model diagram. I didn't do behavioral audience segments for it because we didn't have enough data, but that would be a fun one to go through. Another one that would be fun to go through is my article that's about listening sessions. It's called the tour guide analogy. And the tour guide analogy is what helps you learn what a listening session with a real human is supposed to be like. They're very different than an interview. I don't call them interviews. Because what you're trying to do is just follow that person and follow their way of thinking. So that could be a fun one to look at during a lunch and learn as well. And that is for developing empathy. I'm talking all about developing empathy, not applying it. When you want to talk about applying it, you could use the dog mental model example and try getting the teams. I do this at the end of my one-day workshop. I get the teams in front of the dog mental model and I'm all like, okay, let's pick an area and let's try to come up with some innovations around it. Or let's pretend that we're maybe a pet food company and let's pick an area and try to, come up with 2 different paths or 2 different products or 3 or something based on what's in this area. Or maybe recognize that we're not supporting all of this area, just part of this area. So that's an exercise in applying the mental model diagram. Okay. Thought of one other thing that flitted through my mind. There's a lot of information up on my website for you to go through and select from. So that might be interesting as well. Oh, that's what I wanted to say is that, you know how I mentioned you only do it once a year or whenever you need it, which might not even be once a year. I'm also encouraging teams to start small. Start with 10 participants. 10, 12 participants. I've even done 8 participants and still gotten really good data out of this. So it takes a long time. Actually, in this article that I wrote, and it's on the resources page under newsletter, it's called the 1:10 ratio. And if you take a look at that, that talks about how much time I spend listening to people versus going through all of the data. 1 to 10 is a ratio that I use when I'm doing it formally so that you have an artifact that you can add on to again and again and again over time. This artifact is going to be something that's still valid 50 years from now because our styles of thinking don't change quickly. So it's a valuable thing you would be passing down from team to team to team. If you start with 8 participants, there's the first version of it. Then in another year, you might do 10 participants, you add to it. And in another year, you do another study, you add to it, you keep adding to it. The patterns will start to shift a little bit, bubble a little bit, but But as you see it pulling together, it gets really solid. The interesting thing about qualitative data is that your level of confidence in qualitative data is the level to which, the point at which the patterns come together. If the patterns aren't coming together, then you can't use that data necessarily. Or maybe you've scoped it too broadly. Scoping is another thing that I think is really, really difficult. It's a Goldilocks problem. How do you get it just right? It's not too big, not too small. How do you find the right people? I just did a study for someone where it was an innovation team with appliances, and we wanted to understand what goes through people's minds, what's their inner thinking as they're cooking. But we couldn't just select everybody because, half the universe just grabs something out of the freezer and sticks it in the microwave. So what we wanted to do was select for people who really had a lot of thinking, that then we could get some interesting data. So we selected people who love to cook. That was a criteria. If you love to cook, then we'll think about talking to you as a part of our study. Let's find out more about you. And so it was people who love to cook, who were not already chefs, who haven't necessarily been, working professionally or anything like that. So we went through a series of little narrowings to try to understand what our scope was going to be so that we've got an initial set of data that they can then add to. But that we just finished a month ago, and they're doing innovation work that will be presented at an internal conference in October. So that's kind of a cycle for that thing. So that the idea of the 1 to 10 thing, for that one, we did one of the shortcuts. Instead of keeping that data, like tracking it, we track it from transcripts to a spreadsheet, to another spreadsheet, to a diagram. Instead of doing that, we took it from transcripts, and then over the course of 6 hours together, we were in a workshop, we stood there and we wrote sticky notes, and we put the sticky notes on the wall in the order of affinity, so that we created a mental model diagram that way out of sticky notes. And then we took just a bunch of pictures of it, and we had that kind of thing. We didn't have like, where did the sticky notes come from, and were they written really clearly? So if you go back and read it, say after October, you're not going to remember what it represents. But that's a shortcut way. And that, I've done some experiments, and that knocks out about, it captures at least a third of the data that comes through in those listening sessions. Doesn't capture all of it, but at least captures a third of it. And that's fine for what they wanted to do.
Right.
Okay.
And actually, related, because you mentioned patterns, we have a question here from somebody who's actually curious. Have you found that there's a sort of minimum number of people that one would need to research in order to start finding patterns in behavior? Is that number, the standard Nielsen-Norman 5?
Yeah.
Or is there a wider range?
I'd say it's the standard Nielsen-Norman 5, but you have to scope it right. So like if we had talked to anybody who cooks, and we had only talked to, I think we did 8 people for that study, and we only talked to 8, we might have gotten 8 completely different thinking styles, and we couldn't have done anything with that. And so you want to be careful. I mean, everybody's time is super valuable. You want to be super careful up front about what data you want out the other end of this, and how it's going to, whether it will stick together or not.
Right. And scoping, as you mentioned, it sounds like that's such a pivotal part of the process, right? And
yeah,
we have a couple of folks here who is curious about what is your process to scoping out a research or problem space study?
Yeah.
Is there a certain process or certain activities that you go through to arrive, in that case, right, at figuring out, hey, we just want people who love cooking, right?
Yeah,
Maybe
exactly.
you can help walk through what that looks like.
Yeah, I can totally walk through. And actually, some people just hire me to help them scope, and then they go off and do the rest of it. And maybe I'll come back and help them. I'll mentor them through a couple of different things. But it's a range of things depending on how sure that group of people is about where they want to go with this, how sure they are on what problem they want to solve, and how sure they are about the priorities. So And it doesn't matter how big the company is. I mean, I've worked with startups where they're all like, we don't know. So a lot of the time, like with startups, there's, I don't know, 5 people involved total. And so you sit in a room with 5 people and you're poking at them going, okay, what's important to you? Why did you start this company? What did you just run up against? What was that argument with the VC? Tell me all of these kinds of priorities so I understand where you sit and how you're trying to twist out of this right now, so that we can capture some data that enables that twist, right? There are situations where people are outright, what do I want to say? They don't trust each other internally. So in that case, and so they can't come to agreement about anything, and it's this constant disagreement. In that case, what I do is a series of listening sessions with each stakeholder separately, usually by phone, sometimes in person, doesn't matter. But I ask each person pretty much the same question, which is, what has been on your mind in the last 6 months or so? What's been super important that you've been trying to make happen here at work, right? This is how I elicit the different philosophies and the different things that are guiding the decisions. Most of the time, then I take those transcripts and I pull the data and the patterns out of it, and the patterns line up. And everybody's actually talking about the same thing, but they were using slightly different vocabulary and they didn't realize they were talking about the same thing. Or sometimes they are talking about completely different things and the company wants to go 2 different directions, and you're like, okay, guys, this is what I found. Here's sort of a neutral ground. I'm not going to put any names on this, but there's this philosophy of going this way and this philosophy of going this way. And we have to choose. I mean, we can't support both of those right out the gate. We can choose one now and do one later. And that's what I encourage people to do, is think of it that way. It's not the end of the world. If your company is successful, it's going to be here in another 20 years. It's going to be here in another 5 years. Right? 5 years goes by really fast. And in 5 years, you can do that other path if you are successful. If you make this one thing successful, if you're really focused on it, you can bring it to success. You can build your company or keep your company running. And then you will have the opportunity to try that other path later. So it's really a question of priority, and it's a question of sort of business goal. What is it that I'm trying to get done? What are we trying to achieve sort of as an organization at the moment, and what's important to us? I went into one organization, they're like, oh, accessibility is super important to us. And it turned out they really weren't that interested in it. When you talk to them, they were really interested in a bunch of other things. And so it's trying to suss out what that important thing is. If you are in one of those contentious situations, doing those listening sessions and then pulling them together into a little pattern is a super neutralizing way of doing it. But sometimes you can't be the messenger because you are seen as being political in this thing. So it might be good to have a different person or something be that neutral person pulling that together, or at least presenting that kind of data. I've been hired to do that too. Like specifically, people are like, we can't solve this internally. We have to have someone externally come in and be that neutral stage where, then they can have the discussions.
Right, and actually, we have another question here, really about about artifacts and along the process. And so this person, they've worked with personas before, and they're wondering, within this process, aside from personas, is there any other form of artifact, whether that is a persona or something more extensive, that helps to capture the way that certain people, let's say, they might be potential customers, right? How they sort of think and approach scenarios.
Can you ask that in a different way?
Yeah, I think
I see one question about do 4-quadrant personality grids or Myers-Briggs or something.
No, I think this person was just wondering if they create any sort of, let's see, if you created any sort of, any sort of summarized artifact that represents a way of thinking for a target audience.
Yes. And I've actually got a bunch of examples of those in some of my recorded presentations on my website. I can't tell you at what point they show up, but I'll give you an example verbally. Let's talk about some work that I did for a university. It was a very small state university, and they were interested in attracting more people. They tended to attract people who had already gone off and had a job and then come back. But then there was some contingent of 18-year-olds, basically. And so when I came in and I wanted to scope this sort of thing, all they had was their demographic data. Okay, here are the young people, here are the old people, here are the people who make not a lot of money and need financial aid. And here are the people with the high GPAs, and here are the people with the low GPAs. And I'm like, okay, that has nothing to do with anybody's thinking style. So I couldn't use that to help scope who we were going to recruit. So we recruited a little bit more demographically in that case, but we recruited a big, I think we did 25 people or something there, big selection of people. What came out of it are behavioral audience segments or thinking styles. And so one of them was called means to an end. This is a person who I want to achieve something. It might be, like a stable environment for my family, or a Porsche, or a house in the Bay Area, whatever it was. I want to achieve something that requires like some sort of money or something. How do I get there? And one of the answers is you need a degree in a certain area. And so they're just pursuing that degree to get that bigger profit, not profit, but that bigger goal, right? Their intent, their purpose. There was somebody else that they had a calling. It was a different thinking style. This is the kind of person who's all like, I encountered this idea of nursing, and I saw that, oh my God, this is what I'm supposed to do with my life. I'm passionate about it. One of those people was a woman, a young woman, she was 18 when we talked to her, who had grown up in Bosnia during the war. And this is how she had run across nursing and how it became very passionate for her. Another was a woman who was, I think she was 60. She had just helped her father through his end of life, also interacting with a convalescent home. And she had been an accountant at a department store her whole career. She goes through this experience with her father and suddenly realizes she has a calling to be a nurse. So she's going back to school to become a nurse. This is what it means to have a calling. Okay. There was also a different thinking style that we called exploring paths. And this is the person who was told getting a degree is the next best step. Now you can imagine a lot of different scenarios, like, you know, you're a high schooler and your parents are like, yes, you have to go get a degree. That's the next best step. Or you might be a person who's already had kids and now the kids are in school, and your significant other says, you know, I'm making enough money. Why do I think the next best step is for you to go get that degree that you wanted, right? Or maybe they don't know what they want. So it's just the next best step. I'm going to try this degree. Maybe I don't like it. I'm going to switch degrees or majors or whatever, and try this other major. So those are three examples of how it sounds to describe behavioral audience segment. I've written something on Medium that's called Describing Personas that is still getting about 200 hits a week. I wrote that probably 15 months ago. So it's extremely popular because it helps describe what the difficulties are that we're facing when we're describing people by their demographics and the assumptions that we're pulling in along with that. So what I like to do is really just use the data to tell me what people are saying. That data is not influenced by outside sources like Myers-Briggs or anything. It's just influenced by the people in the study, which means there are always more people out there. In the cooking study that I did, for example, among people who love to cook, there are 3 styles that we found, but there are probably more, right? There was a style that was called the creative innovator who never liked following a recipe. There was the style called the culinarian who really knew a heck of a lot about cooking. There was the style that was called the careful planner who would see like an Instagram, something like, I want to make that, you know, how do I make it? I want to make sure it turns out like that. But there's more. There are other ways, other styles of thinking. We just captured those three. What I like to do is use the analogy of an episodic TV show. You have the main characters and you know their context, right? But there are other characters that sort of come into play in the story in other areas. And those other areas might be areas that your organization wants to turn to. So it's nice to use that idea that it's a bunch of characters. It's like a bunch of characters in a story. And there are different contexts to explore. And there's always more context to explore. It's just that what does your organization want to focus on so that they can be successful, so that they're, flying high in another 5 years and they can consider another area as well.
Right, and we actually have a question here that is really about recruiting for research. And so this person is curious, in most cases, do you recruit users yourself or do you use a third-party service for that?
More and more I'm starting to recruit myself. The third-party services that some of them work. It depends on who we're trying to get. Like, if we're trying to get a data storage expert, you can't use a third party because data storage experts are so busy, they're never going to sign up for that third party's database. The other thing is that the people who sign up for those databases that the third party mines, those kinds of people are intent on earning money this way. And if you've ever read Steve Portigal's book, War Stories, there's some stories about how, you can't recruit on Craigslist because you're just going to get people who invent stuff that they think you want to hear. So I've been doing more and more recruiting myself. I do a dual level recruit. It's a typical kind of recruit where you try to gather names that are pretty. I send them through a survey, right? And, do you do this or that? And tell me a little bit about this, and a little bit of essay question sort of stuff. And then once I get that, some people out of there that I want to talk to, I'll call them up and I'll do a screener with them. Okay. And in the screener, what I'm trying to do is figure out if they really do have depth that they can talk about in this region. So the last one, that cooking study that I did, I think there were 3 or 4 people that I called up. I'm like, oh, they sound great on paper. Their essay answers sound really great. But you get them on the phone and there's no there. So I couldn't use them. But you try to be gentle and say, okay, yeah, we'll have you on the hold list and I'll call you back if we need you, kind of a thing. So that's really, it depends question. I mean, for cooking, you'd think, oh yeah, you could get plenty of people off of a vendor's list, a recruiting agency's list. And I probably could have used a recruiting agency for that, but the last time that I did that was for people who take care of clothes, people who are like washing their own clothes, and that particular recruiter couldn't find people who wash their own clothes. I'm like, okay, I just don't trust you anymore. So yeah.
Gotcha. The next question that we have here, head up here in a second.
Yeah. Oh, there's a follow-on to that too. Is that it is? I try to do 2 degrees separate at least. Friends of friends. I don't use my friends. I like to use my friends' friends. People I don't know. People who seem to be out. At least a couple levels. And I have a lot of reach on social media. So I can find some really decent candidates. But let's say I was recruiting for people who work on farms. I actually probably could do that through my school, which has connections to that. But that might be a little bit more difficult. So again, it's a contextual sort of a question. But I just wanted to put it out there, if you are doing your own recruiting, never recruit your own friends. That just is putting too much of a twist on it.
Right. The next question here is actually rather interesting, and that's, how do you decide, when you're creating mental models, right? At what point do you decide that those mental models are good enough to start using to create the solution?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You will, as you start adding data, as you start doing the affinity stuff, the pattern finding, you will get the feeling that something solid is forming, or you will get the feeling that it's a mess. If you get the feeling that something solid is forming, then that's pretty good. And you will want to look at the edges and see if the edges are still sort of a mess or not. Generally, what I do, I've gotten really good at scoping things. So when I do these, the affinity stuff, the pattern stuff, I generally find it coming together. There have been a couple of them where it was just a mess. And so what we had to do was a second study where we took as a smaller scope or a more specific focus. And then we could use some of the data from the first study that had affinity with this stuff. It's generally what I do is I try to use all of the data that I've collected. And all of the data that I've collected does form something solid. There are points or inflections that it goes through where it seems to be forming into this solid pattern, and then once you've added like 2 or 3 more from the set of people. So like I've done 10 listening sessions, and I've put 3 of them together and it's sort of forming this pattern. Then I put the 4th and the 5th one in, and all of a sudden I'm like, no, I have to break this part apart over here and put this part over here. So it goes through inflections like that. And there are places it does an inflection at about 10 where it seems like it seems pretty solid, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, wait, it goes like this. And when you're seeing this inflection, you're reorganizing, you're always asking yourself, oh crap, am I just messing it up? Am I forcing this? But since you're doing it from the bottom up, since you're not coming up with mental spaces, you're not coming up with towers first, you're just looking at the summaries and you're matching those together, you're not making it up. So if you follow that bottom up approach, you're never making it up. You're not putting your own pattern on it and forcing it into a shape. So that's important to consider when you're pulling it together. There's another inflection point. It goes through like around 15, 16. Another one that I've seen happen more up at like 28, 30, stuff like that. So you'll see it go through inflection points, but those are different than having just a complete mess where nothing seems to go together. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually this, so, speaking of mental models, someone here was curious, have you ever tried to connect mental models with the practice of user story mapping? Or
yeah.
If so, how does that kind of, how do those two work?
I've seen it happen. I have never led that. I end up working pretty much in the development side in that problem space cycle, but I've seen it happen where people, okay, like I said, when you're accessing in your ideation phase in that cycle that was over on the one side, the solution space cycle, in that ideation phase, you're maybe looking at a couple towers in that whole mental model diagram. They may be contiguous, they may be spaced out a lot, but you're only looking at a couple of towers when you're doing some sort of consideration. And when you're looking at those towers, you can use the data in there to create user stories where you take a character. So remember like your 3 behavioral audience segments that we had? For the cooking styles, you would take one of those characters and you would write a story for that set of towers, okay? And that story is gonna be based on a purpose or an intent that person's trying to achieve. I wanna bring my mom to the Grand Canyon while she still can, not the I wanna make a reservation, right? Not that I want to have a vacation where like I'm going to solve it by giving you a hotel and a rental car and an airline. So you want to write your user stories using the data in the towers, which represents the thinking toward a purpose. One of the things that I do with the mental model diagram when I normalize the data is I put it all first person present tense. so that automatically when you start reading it and using it, you're speaking as if you are that character. You're speaking as if I worry that mom isn't going to make it through this connecting airport, right? So you're not putting a barrier between yourself, and it just makes it easier to become that person, to walk in their shoes when you're in that ideation phase of your development cycle. Does that answer that one?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, no, that's definitely a very comprehensive answer here. And someone else here actually, I think this is a pretty general question, but most of us who work in product have definitely felt this at some point, which is, this person says they sometimes feel like they're more empathic than other times, right?
Yeah.
Are there any sort of practices they can do to just make empathy a sort of ongoing exercise?
Yeah, and the second question too, the one from the people at Cooper, I think
Right.
into this too. How many people have heard that book by Paul Bloom called Against Empathy? So what he did was he used a definition of empathy that's called emotional contagion. And he's saying, this idea of like looking at a child who's impoverished and seeing the child in a refugee camp makes you feel sorry for them, and so you donate, right? And he's calling that empathy. That is more like emotional contagion. So the idea is that as you are using your understanding of what goes through another person's mind, it is not emotional contagion. So you're not necessarily going to agree with those emotions or reactions or decisions that they're making, but you're going to acknowledge them. At the airline, this is actually really important. You all have seen at the airport the person who's really freaked out about the delayed airplane, right? And gets like all ranty or whatever the problem is. But there's a problem in there. You've seen this kind of person. And we had a behavioral audience segment for that kind of a person. And the folks at the airline wanted to call them the grumbler. And I told them, okay, we can't call them a name that they wouldn't call themselves. Let's go back through the transcripts and try to figure out a name. And the name we came up with was the frustrated, because that was the word they kept using over and over again. I'm frustrated that I can't rely on this stupid airline to get me where I needed to be, blah, 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 that kind of a thing. Over and over again, though, they kept reverting into the like, well, she shouldn't react that way. She's just, she's asking us to do something that's impossible. Why doesn't she understand it's impossible? Why doesn't she just that kind of thing. I was like, no, her pain is real. And just like that woman who was trying to drive her car through the race course with all the racers on it, and she was very angry, I couldn't tell her, you shouldn't be angry. I could only say, okay, I understand your anger. I'm going to dwell in that anger with you, not being angry myself, but acknowledging your anger, acknowledging that, yeah, you got home last night at 2 a.m. and you just totally forgot to park your car outside. I get it. With the frustrated, I was like, yeah, you're missing your child's first recital, piano recital, because of this delay. I get it, right? So as soon as you establish the I get it part, and as soon as you establish that rapport using emotional empathy, then you can go forward, right? Then you can go forward with supporting that person, helping them get or achieve what they want to achieve, okay? But there is a problem within most of our organizations where we take the perspective of the employee and we're saying, hey, they shouldn't be doing this because it's just not possible. And like, no, they should be doing this because that's their emotion. Let's understand their emotion and let's support that thing. Let's try to figure out, okay, well, how about we figure out how to dial in to your child's recital so that you can listen to it right here in the gate. And in fact, we've got a little room here that's quiet. We're going to give you this room and let you dial into your child's recital. That's simple, right?
Yeah, Yeah, that's a very valid point.
Right? But you see that that's the emotional empathy. That's what we're using with emotional empathy. Cognitive empathy is what I'm using for all of these patterns. There's a huge swirl about empathy, which is why we can have all these, these books like Against Empathy come out. Well, sure, they're talking about one kind of empathy. The word compassion comes up too, and Dr. Brene Brown, has done a bunch of TED Talks and has done some talk about the difference between sympathy and empathy and compassion. And compassion is the act. So compassion is giving somebody that room so that they can listen to their child's piano concerto, or first piano recital. Okay, that's what compassion is. That's that act. Okay, the sympathy is is staying on the outside and saying, "Oh, sucks to be you," right? Really, it sounds awful.
Yeah.
But it's not acknowledging that, and I'm like frowning at you because I don't want you to be angry, right? And empathy is being in that emotion, acknowledging that emotion. Yes, it's a totally valid emotion. I get it. Let me support you in that so that we can then talk and maybe come up with something that would let me show a little compassion.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And since this has been a great discussion, and it's hard to believe that an hour has actually passed, but we'll take the last question here, and I think we'll end this on I think a very relatable note here. And this question, I saw a couple of these along the same theme, which is, do you advocate for looping in the development team directly into user research activities? And if so, what activities or methods have you found useful, to make the most of their time?
Okay, so I'm going to push back on your question because you said the word user research.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
That is a good question.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna make that sort of that, wait a minute, what is she saying? Sort of a thing. It's like I want to constantly call your attention to the idea of when you use that word user and what do you mean by user research. I have a cube diagram that shows all these different quadrants. You need to be doing research in all of these different areas. Some of them are users and some of them are at the level of being people. I don't do user research. I don't touch upon how evaluating how people use the tool or generating ideas, design ideas. So evaluative and generative user research, those are both very valid things. I don't really do them that often. In fact, it's probably been 15 years since I've ever done any of it. Because I've been so focused on trying to get this other problem space stuff going, trying to understand when somebody has a purpose, how they achieve that purpose. So to answer the question though, how do you get the developers involved? It depends on the developer again. It's very important to understand that there are mindsets out there that are really thrilled and interested in this stuff. And there are mindsets out there that are like, okay, I'm glad that we have it, but could you just tell me what's important and guide me which direction to go? I think within the product manager area, and if your developer is half product manager, I think this applies, is that it's very, and if you've got, business stakeholders, the people who are higher up who are saying, yes, you can take some time and spend some money on this and resources. I think it's really important to try to get them to hear a listening session, which will let them understand, like all the time when I've got CEOs listening to these things, I'll sit there with them or whatever, or I'll have them dial in, or I'll even just give them a transcript and they'll read while they're having dinner or something. And they'll always come back to me and say, hey, this has nothing to do with my product. And I'm like, bingo. Yes, it has nothing to do with your product, and that's important. This is this other box that we also need to explore, right? So that we can apply empathy. So I do that. That helps a lot. And the second thing is to show people how this data comes together. So I actually get more pushback with the idea of it being qualitative versus quantitative. Quantitative numbers, you know, you can totally trust numbers. But the problem is the numbers only tell you what, they don't tell you why, and you have to guess why. Anytime you guess, you're taking a risk. So like print that out and put it on your cubicle. Anytime you guess, you're taking a risk. So if you're guessing about why some of these behaviors are happening, you need to go ask why. Okay, this is a great way to get people more involved. Listening sessions are actually really interesting because they're very human and they have they occur on the phone so people can dial in and mute themselves, or just listen to the recording on their own time, like when they're working out at the gym or walking the dog or whatever. So I encourage people to try to listen to something like this and understand just that we're really not talking about a user. We're not talking about a customer. We're not talking about somebody who has a relationship to your organization. We're talking to somebody about their very human thing. And it's actually really interesting. It's fascinating that if we do the listening session right, that person is talking the entire time, and we only ask one question at the very beginning, which is, tell me everything that went through your mind the last time you were debugging something.
Right. And
Right.
I think that's a great note to kind of close on, which is, you know, Agile, of course, was always, I think it was focused more originally 15 or 16 years ago, really about how to build the right thing better.
Mm-hmm.
The conversations that happen a lot in design, and I think that are happening here, is really how do we figure out how do we even know that it's the right thing, right? And that's where all
Exactly.
space work comes in.
Yeah,
And
that's what we're guessing.
Yeah, and that's sort of been, well, that whole struggle is kind of part of why we're doing this conference, right? Because user experience always starts with, how do we know that this is the right problem?
Right.
And I think that's why your work is especially relevant for people that work in Agile teams, because that is something that easily gets lost when people start going through, you know, oh, here's the sprints, and they go through that almost mechanical cycle of doing things. And so, yeah, thank you so much, Indy. This has been a great session here. We had so many questions, and of course, we couldn't answer them all in here, but I am going to provide a link here. So these are the 2 Rosenfeld media books, again, that Indy has written. We have both of them. I know our user researcher has read the mental models, and I think she might have also read the one above. But they're very practical and useful, and yeah, they go into tremendous detail about.
I just said in my last newsletter that I'm coming out with a 2nd edition of Mental Models, because I've changed the vocabulary and the way I speak about it quite a bit, and also infused it with more empathy, so that you're sort of reading from first-person present tense. You can walk in somebody's shoes easier. That should be out probably in a year, I'm saying.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was something that Lou was working on with you.
Yeah.
But that's great. And just so people know, Indy, I'll invite you here too. But here is our Slack group, and if you have more than 3 years of experience on a product team, we encourage you to apply. We have almost 4,000 people there. We've got a lot of the speakers there. It's kind of acting as our virtual lobby in a way as well, and there's a lot of conversations that spill over there. So yeah, the next session we have is with Damon Dimmick, who is a senior design director with Endurance Insurance, I believe. He used to be at Constant Contact. And he's going to be talking about design spikes and the dual track Agile process based on how he's done it. I believe he's also a certified Scrum Master as well. So very knowledgeable person, and yeah, talking about how they make design and Agile kind of live in harmony more, what they've learned in the past many years in his case. And let me find the URL for that, and hopefully I can see you guys there. And I believe we're starting that in 15 minutes here, so it'll be very soon. Otherwise, yeah, Indy, thanks a lot for joining us. Really
Yeah.
time. And it was a lot of fun. And
thank you, and thanks to everybody who stayed up late in Europe and other areas.
Yeah, I think we had 700 to 800 people here joining us from many places. So this was really cool. And here is the link to the next session, and we will see you guys there. Yeah,
Awesome.
thanks a lot. Have a great rest of the day, Andy.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, take care.
Bye, everybody.